There are 5 key costs that make up a software development project, but one stands out far beyond the rest. In this video, I'll take you through how to assess the pure software development expense for your project. Hi, my name is Adam McGowan, Firefield's CEO. My day job is to help non-technical leaders harness technology in order to grow, protect, or spark change in their businesses. I created tech for the Exec to do the same for you. In this video, I'm going to dive deep into the biggest cost of developing software, the design and coding of the application itself. All right, in order to get a good estimate around pure development, let's start by defining at least what we mean when we talk about pure development. We describe it with its starting point being the first instance when you've begun real earnest design of what this product is going to look like. That doesn't necessarily mean visual design, but just the design of the workflows, the way users would traverse through the application. That's the earliest point when we think about design. And the latest point when we think about pure development would be once that product has been launched. That could be launched out to the world if it was for the public. It could be to your team if it's for your employees. But once it's launched and it's effectively working as expected, so generally bug-free. And the next piece of this estimation framework we've got to think about are the stages of development involved. And we generally think of them in 3 parts. So let's call it design, then building, and then launching. And if we want to be a little more technical, let's replace those with discovery at the beginning, development in the middle, and release in the end. And in the case of the example we're using, we've got a couple of additional assumptions. The first one is that you'll be using a third-party resource to get this work done. Generally a company, an agency, some other shop who's going to be responsible for doing the work and also for giving you a quote. Also, an assumption we're going to be making here is that that entity is responsible for the 3 phases we described: design, or I should say discover, develop, and ultimately release. Whether they do all the work themselves or subcontract out, let's assume they're at least leading the charge on all 3. Now, obviously, no 2 technology projects are the same, so it would be impossible here to come up with real estimates of cost. But again, we're trying to come up with a bit of a framework. So the idea we're trying to assess here is to make sure we lay out things that you're considering as you go through the process. So we've started by laying out our examples and our assumptions. Next, let's talk through some of the factors you should be thoughtful of to make sure you don't exclude them in your thinking of cost. So there are a few not so obvious factors involved in discovery. The first of them has to do with validation and how much validation has been done. So what I mean by that is how many of the assumptions that underlie the product, something as simple as it will be used, or it will generate more revenue for us, or our customers will become more engaged if they had it. Those are big assumptions. And the level of validation that's been done can range dramatically from very little, you're just going on a hunch, to extremely well validated. It's usually the case that the greater amount of validation done, the less work your third-party resource will have to do in discovery because that will already be handled. One word of caution, I've seen projects where not much validation has been done and the non-tech exec thinks it's not important to do it. It's critical to do this. Oftentimes it can be a little bit jarring because the expense and time added on to do this work with the help of a third party can be material, but it's hugely important. Another factor to keep in mind at the discovery stage is the type of development methodology this resource is going to use. There's a number of ways to do it, but there's 2 pretty broad categories. One's called Agile, the other is called Waterfall. I won't get into all of the deep tech speak. We'll likely have another video to cover this in the future. But broadly speaking, waterfall means deal with all the documentation up front, everything. Map it all out, extensive. Dotting I's, crossing T's, lots and lots of documentation. It's typically slow, and it can oftentimes be very challenging if you want to make changes in the future. A more current approach that you'll hear, like I said, probably a lot about is Agile. Easiest way to describe Agile, it's just very iterative and collaborative. The upside, a lot more flexibility. The downside, it's a lot harder to make estimations up front when you've decided on a very fluid methodology. Someone will say, how much is it going to cost using your Agile method? And the answer is often, it depends, because as we do the work and as we iterate, we learn and things change. So it is important that not only will the volume of time required between Agile versus Waterfall be different, but the certainty around the estimate, or at least the implied certainty, or what the vendor will suggest as far as how certain it is, will differ a lot between those two different methodologies. Now on to the not so obvious factors impacting development during a software project. So the first one has to do with the level of documentation. So this isn't so much a level of documentation you demand, it's the level of documentation your resource is comfortable providing. People have different philosophies on this. Some are extremely documentation heavy, some aren't. There's a number of great reasons for and against these differing approaches, and they relate back to that notion of agile development. It's content for another video, but thinking through the volume of documentation is important when you're getting a quote, because it should have a pretty meaningful impact. More documentation means more time and more money. Oftentimes it's the right choice, but again, that's probably fodder for another video. Another aspect is the level of communication that goes on during development. Some philosophies of firms is that we've done discovery, we've laid out the designs, we've figured out what we're doing, we're going to put our heads down now and go. We don't want to be distracted, we'll come back in a few months with updates. Others take a very collaborative approach, demonstrating progress once a week, communicating multiple times a week. Generally, we think that the latter approach is better, but the right sizing amount of communication can differ project by project. What's important is that knowing how much communication you're going to get is critical, because it should have an impact on the cost. And the third not so obvious factor has to do with the testing of the code and the testing in the browser. How does it actually work on the phone or on Chrome or Firefox? How well does it actually work? And so the critical piece here is that different firms will have different approaches to how they address testing. Again, we have a philosophy. Ours is more testing is better, but that's also content for another time. But understanding how much testing goes into the product is critical, even to the point of simply quality assurance at the end of the development cycles. Less testing likely means they could finish faster, possibly cheaper, but at what other cost? Really important to keep that in mind. And finally, let's talk about some of the not so obvious factors affecting deployment. So it might seem that it's the time when you just turn the switch on. Not true at all. Big impact on the scope and effort required in deployment has to do with how mission critical is this product. Is it a production or enterprise grade product that's replacing something you were using every day to run the business? Well, the impact of that deployment on your company is a lot bigger than if you're testing some prototype with a new type of customer. So it's a big deal. So the mission critical nature is very, very important. Also, what kind of data you've got to move into this tool. Is it a brand new tool? No data in at all, turn the switch on, spin it up, get working? That's one thing. If there's millions of records of prior data from an old system that has to be moved in and make sure it all works seamlessly, big, big difference. There's also the question of how much training does the development team or this agency or firm need to do to get your people up to speed and ready to go. And so, we talk about the cost of your people, the time they spend. That's an additional cost of development to you. That's the human expense. We deal with that in another video. But the development team, they have to spend time writing out more documentation, performing possibly some of the training. That's going to go into the quote too, and it's really important for you to keep in mind. Paying for dev isn't a surprise. Click this video to learn about the next and less obvious cost of software development. And don't forget to subscribe. I'm adding new content at least once a week to help you compete and win in an increasingly technical world. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next episode.